LegalizeFreedom.com. Why are we here? Where do we come from? Where are we going? From the nature of reality to the future of humanity. Beyond politics, poverty and war. LegalizeFreedom.com.
Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host Greg Moffat, and my guest today is Chris Nineham, who joins us to discuss his book, How the Establishment Lost Control, and also some of the political, economic and social turmoil of our time. From the Scottish referendum to the Brexit debacle and the shock election of Jeremy Corbyn as UK Labour leader and Donald Trump as US President, the post-war consensus is breaking up. This turmoil testifies to an insurgent mood amongst great swathes of the population both at home and abroad. How the establishment lost control attempts to explain these dramatic developments and to show how they question received notions about politics, history and how change happens. Above all, they challenge widespread assumptions about the resilience of elite hegemony, the influence of conventional structures of thought, and the ability of the mass of the population to think autonomously in a post-ideological age. At the close of the 20th century, we were told, and millions of us believed, that the neoliberal New World Order was here to stay and that it was simply a matter of time before its now incontrovertible benefits touched all corners of the globe. The polarisation, upheaval, and often chaotic events of the early 21st century, however, portend a very different future teeming with threats and uncertainty. But within this flux and deep doubt, there also exists the potential for positive change, should we choose to seize the moment. Hello and welcome, Chris, and thank you so much for joining us today on LegalizeFreedom.com.
Nice to be here.
Chris, today we're going to be talking about a recent book of yours, How the Establishment Lost Control. Before we jump into that, just tell listeners a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work in general.
Well, I suppose I'm an activist. I'm very involved in the anti-war movement, in the Stop the War Coalition. One of the organisers of it, have been since it was set up back in 2001. I'm a socialist. I'm an author. I've written a few books on subjects that are kind of related to this, and I've done a certain amount of kind of academic research into some of the questions surrounding these issues as well.
Okay, well, just to set the scene for what we're going to discuss, maybe we should think about the background of events and how we got where we are today in terms of politics, economics, the social order. There was a time that we both lived through, the 1980s and through into the 1990s. We had the era of Thatcher and Reagan. You know, they revolutionised a lot of aspects of their respective nations, and this, of course, had ripple effects throughout the world. We had the collapse of the Soviet Union. We had Francis Fukuyama's end of history type idea, and there really was a feeling at a certain point that the neoliberal sort of New World Order was here to stay. It had finally triumphed. There were just a few remaining corners of the globe, but yet to feel its, to bask in its glory. But in next to no time, there's one system, more or less, would straddle the world, and all those alternatives that had been tried and proved to be wanting in the past would finally be thrown into the dustbin of history, and we'd march off into a bright, glowing future. However, that's not quite how things have turned out.
Yeah, well, I mean, I've, as you suggest, in a way, unfortunately, I've lived through many of these and been involved in many of the struggles that attended the kind of imposition of neoliberalism by establishments and elites all around the world, and in some ways pioneered by the British ruling class and the Americans. And they have obviously been utterly decisive in shaping our lives. And, for the first time in really since the Second World War, I think people now feel as if their lives are probably worse than their parents' lives, and their children's lives will be worse than their own, which is a kind of novel experience, and one that I think is quite, an influential one, and having a big effect on society. But one of the things that I argue that's central to the book is that the kind of commentariat, the liberal and even some of the left commentariat, have been very surprised by the unravelling of this kind of free market regime that we've all lived under for the last 30, 40 years. And one of the things that I point out is that they really shouldn't be, because while it's true that the elites, that neoliberalism has become a kind of consensual set of ideas amongst the elites in many parts of the world, and whole sections of the kind of middle-class commentariat bought into them as well and regarded them as being set in stone and actually sort of decisively won, if you like. For the vast majority of the population, they've been experienced as a kind of horrible shock and awe, and really never been accepted. And I think one of the big mistakes that at least parts of the left has made over the last 30 years is to kind of assume that really people have bought into the free market, and that Thatcherism, when Thatcher said, oh, there is an alternative, that that was what people really felt. Well, actually, as I go through in the book, even in the darkest days of Thatcher's attacks on the miners and her serial election victories and the Falklands and so forth, even then, the mainstream opinion polls showed that most working people really didn't like it, rejected the free market, didn't buy into the idea that privatisation was good, felt that, a lot of the kind of things that are regarded as old-fashioned, that, there should be more taxes on the rich, there should be more spending on the welfare state and so forth. People remained convinced of those ideas. Social democratic consciousness never went away. And so the fact that it's kind of re-erupted after 35 years of this experience really shouldn't surprise anyone. In a way, I'm surprised that it took so long, and that's another story. But, I think it's an indication of just how remote the journalists on The Guardian and at the BBC and blah, blah, blah are from the experience of ordinary people, that anyone was taken by surprise by the kind of things that have happened.
I remember the point in time in the 1980s where, the right to buy, and this is in the UK, of council houses for tenants, and privatisation of utilities, like British Gas, for example, being the big one, and the campaign around that. Looking back, those are just kind of like bribes in a way that they were part of the government's overall agenda. But in my experience, anyway, the time when there was some kind of feel-good factor, and maybe people were, on the up, and yes, we had a lot of privatisation, a lot of industries being wound down or offshored or whatever, but that you could point to people doing better. It was actually quite a narrow window. There was a little bit of a purple patch, but it wasn't how it was portrayed in the media, because throughout the 1990s, which is the main decade, I think, we characterised, I think, perhaps in some ways in the UK, certainly by Tony Blair and his, things can only get better, and, New Labour and all of that. It was a really quite short window in time, and it wasn't long before Blair found himself in trouble and that gloss wore off. And the same thing happened with Bill Clinton in the US at that time. And in the 1990s, I well remember travelling around the country and people struggling with the same issues as they always had. And just throw in a slight curveball, I felt that the events of 9/11 and then the whole onslaught of the war on terror and all that terrible stuff we've been trudging through ever since, it made people think differently about what was important about their lives, and it threw open a lot of issues and shone a light in world affairs in a way that I can't really describe. And I don't know if this makes any sense to you, but I just felt that something changed. And suddenly the platitudes of politicians, people like Blair, and consumerism and material goods and these things that could be delivered by capitalism, they kind of lost their veneer and their gloss a little bit.
I think you're absolutely right about that. And a couple of other things. One is that it's obviously true that people did take up the right to buy. Some people, or lots of people, and obviously people did buy the shares and stuff. But I mean, that, it's important not to make a kind of simple equation between people doing that and people thinking that it's necessarily the right thing to do. I mean, they did it because it was available and there didn't seem to be any kind of opposition to it. But I think it's very important to see in the 80s and the early 90s that there was a kind of terrible failure of leadership in the Labour movement, that there was all these arguments knocking around from Neil Kinnock and from the Ron Todds and the trade union leaders at the time, that workers had been bought off, and that everyone believed the Sun, and all the opinion polls show that actually people didn't read the Sun because they thought it was good politically. They read it for the cartoons and maybe the page 3 at worst, but nevertheless it didn't mean that they bought into Murdoch. And there was a kind of, even on the more radical left, there was this sort of thing about, postmodernism and this kind of, post-Fordist world in which class no longer mattered. Meanwhile, the working class was suffering and actually fighting as well. The miners' strike happened in the middle of all this. It was one of the biggest working class struggles this country's ever seen. So it's a complicated story, and I don't want to be too simplistic about it, but I think it's very important to see that the anger and the bitterness and even a serious level of class consciousness was sustained throughout the 1980s and 1990s. And Blairism was a very contradictory, paradoxical moment, because when people voted in droves for Labour in 1997, they thought they were voting for change, but actually what they were doing was voting for a kind of watered down Thatcher light, kind of slightly modified version that had been imported into the Labour Party. So there was this, like you say, there was a strange ideological turmoil, which I think it took a bit of time for people to realise what was going on. But definitely by the time that Tony Blair hooked up with George Bush and, so explicitly nailed his colours to the mast of the kind of neocon experiment and the neocon project, people were getting more and more wound up by him. And I think there is a sense in which, the Iraq war in itself was a kind of, everyone really thought it was going to be a terrible thing, but it kind of crystallised a sense that something had gone very wrong with the Labour leadership, and that, there was really a kind of toxic problem at the heart of New Labour. And that partly explains why there was such a massive, because before it, remember, and many people won't, even know, obviously, but there was something called the anti-capitalist movement in the years from 2000 to, from 1999 to sort of early in the next decade. There were these huge mobilizations, some of which I was involved in actually, against the World Trade Organization and against the G8 and the IMF, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating around the world against the sort of neoliberal capitalist order. And that was one of the backdrops to the kind of eruption, the insurgent anti-war movement that developed around the question of Iraq. So I think you're right to say that Iraq was more than about the war. It was about war, but it was about, of a sort of visceral sense, that there was a kind of poison at the heart of the political establishment. And I think that partly explains the massive outpouring of anger that resulted.
From what we've been saying about the sequence of events unfolding over decades, and you mentioned earlier about the surprise of many of the elites about some relatively recent turns of events. If you think about it, Brexit, Trump, Scottish independence, Bernie Sanders' emergence, Corbyn, even Farage and UKIP, these things have been decades in the making, and they're all a result of so many avenues of expression being suppressed, so much of the same old from political parties, the inability to get a cigarette paper between the major parties in the UK, even sometimes in the US and many European countries in terms of policy. And Brexit itself became something of a lightning conductor. People were voting not necessarily for Brexit itself, but for something different. And as we have now discovered, didn't even know what they were going to get. But it's like anything, any other flavour of bullshit other than the one we're getting. We're just going to try something different. You know, it really was a case of almost like Russian roulette in a way. This could go horribly wrong, but we just can't take more and more of the same.
I think there's an element of, there's more than an element of truth in that. I think there was a kind of rebellion. There was a kind of, it partly represented a rebellion and a kind of rejection of what existed, and this was the only option we got. And I mean, one of the things about the whole Brexit vote is the famously stupid move by David Cameron, but it wasn't just stupid at a party political level or a personal level. It was disastrous, really, for British politics, because it kind of channeled a lot of very mixed feelings and very deeply held sense of exclusion and anger and class resentment through a question that really couldn't kind of handle those different ideas. And actually it wasn't until that point a question that was particularly much on people's minds, but it just was an opportunity for people to make a statement. I'd put it slightly differently, though. I'd say that, there was obviously a very mixed bag of kind of different reasons why people voted Brexit. But, there is a kind of central issue here that does speak very directly to, I think, people's concerns and their legitimate concerns, which is the question of sovereignty or democracy, put in another way. And I think people felt that, and still do feel, that over the last 30 years, whatever minimal control people have had over their lives and over the society they live in has been reduced massively, that the kind of political and economic order has taken no account of what people want and has actually snatched away many of the things that people had struggled for over decades, the welfare state and certain job security and the right to have trade unions and all of these things. And that the way this expressed itself was through a sense of we have no control. And people said, well, hang on a minute, maybe it's got some connection with the fact that, a lot of political decisions are being made in Brussels by people who actually many of whom aren't elected, because there's clearly a huge bigger democratic deficit in Brussels than there is in Westminster. And so, I think there's a rational core to the argument. A large number of people who voted Brexit felt, which is that, we need to get control back over our lives. And, this distant bureaucracy in Brussels is completely out of our control. So I can very much understand that. And, that's why, each of the cases you cite, the Corbyn case, the Scottish independence case, the Trump thing is a whole nother question because it's not in Britain. But, they're all different instances that have different dynamics, but they are all connected to this very, very central experience of the whole political and social reality of the last 35 years, which is that, working people's lives have been attacked massively, and our conditions and the resources that we have some sort of access to have been taken away, but also that our democratic access has been taken away. Our access to any kind of democracy has been massively eroded and taken away, whether it's local councils being, having their funding reduced massively, whether it's the fact that, like you say, the difference between the political parties has been reduced to almost nothing until recently. So all of these things have created a whole series of explosive reactions. And it's incredible that even now, it's not just that the elites don't seem to grasp this, or most of them don't, but that, a lot of the liberal commentariat simply seem incapable of understanding it, or certainly don't want to understand it, because I think we underestimate the extent to which the Blair moment was a moment when, a lot of the more privileged sort of upper middle class people felt, the people who kind of run the TV stations and edit the newspapers, they felt, at last everyone accepts that the free market is right and that making money isn't a crime and profits are good and they benefit everyone. And all. There was this moment when it really did appear as if there was no alternative intellectually, and that was a moment that layer of society embraced, I think, with joy, and they can't break from it, because the nightmare is that the ghost of socialism and socialist ideas is actually returning in the guise of the unlikely guise of the member for Islington North. So, this is a shock that they can't understand, and they certainly don't want to understand. They don't want to accept, which explains their hostility to him.
This lack of agency that we've been referring to is really felt by millions of people is really key here. And the liberal media, or liberal commentariat, as you call it, which I don't quite like that phrase, they played a part here in this too, of course, bringing these issues to a head by basically demonizing people who wanted change, some of whom have been attempting to enact some of this change or get back some control, however mistakenly some people might say, voting for Brexit because they're really not sure what else to do. And the liberal media, of course, demonized Trump in the US and Farage and UKIP here, and Le Pen in France, for example. And it doesn't matter what you think about these people. The point is, the mainstream media demonized them. They went out of their way to kill their message, to ridicule it, and the people who supported them. But what they then did, effectively in many ways, was try to lump all these people together. Ergo, so if you're going to vote for Brexit, no matter what your reasoning or thinking, you are also with the far right and racists, etc., etc. And that became very polarizing because a lot of people didn't want to be lumped in with that. The polarization, in some ways, it might be seen, that we see in politics, might actually be, the beginning of a process of this resolving itself. Poles have to go very far apart in order for the situation itself to be resolved. When a problem becomes so intractable, something has to change. Maybe you have to go through darkest before dawn, I suppose, is the best way to express it.
Well, I think there's two things here. It's like, I think the potential for there being a kind of useful development and useful evolution of a kind of new movement for democracy and some return to people actually taking control of their lives is definitely there. But it does depend, as you suggest, on the left actually being able to make some quite tricky calls, and also to not kind of go along with the mainstream sort of liberal interpretation here, because on the one hand, there's a kind of total lack of understanding in the mainstream about the shocks that have taken place. But on the other hand, and connected, there's also a kind of rolling everything together. So people talk about Trump and Brexit in the same breath, when in fact, I'm not saying that there is a connection between the two things, but they are very, very different, and we have to be very concrete about our analysis in particular situations. And there's a sort of thing about populism but what does the word populism really mean when you get down to it? I think it can be a useful term if it's used to describe a kind of fake radical right appeal to the nation or to the people. But there's nothing really that connects in terms of political content Trump and Jeremy Corbyn. They're opposite ends of the pole. And in every way they're contrasted. Jeremy's an ultra Democrat apart from anything else, whereas Donald Trump clearly is the opposite. And so we've got to be much smarter. The left has got to be much smarter, and we mustn't just continue to sort of just accept categories that are being promoted by the mainstream media, because these people don't understand anything about what's going on. I think it's that's one crucially important element of the situation if we're going to be able to make the most of the situation. And I think we need to also think very carefully about the whole question of the EU, really, because the fact that there are people on the left who are arguing seriously that there should be a second referendum, whatever your views about the first referendum, however you voted first time round, it seems to me that it's extremely dangerous to be promoting the idea that there should be a second referendum, because this will play into the right wing's depiction of the left as being part of the kind of Westminster liberal elite that doesn't accept a vote when it happens and just calls for a revote until they get the result they want. The crucial thing about a serious left at the moment is we've got to be the insurgents. I mean, it's not being radical that's the problem or that's off-putting to people at the moment. It's been looking like the status quo. And the truth is that the vast, the overwhelming bulk of the British ruling class want us to stay in Europe, would like that Brexit decision to be reversed. And if the left, positions itself alongside those elites, we're going to end up in a very, very dangerous situation. So I think, at the level of analysis and understanding on the left needs to be deepened in order for us to take this. Well, I agree with you. We've got big opportunities at the moment. And I thought, for example, Jeremy's position of, a people's Brexit was an intelligent way to respond to the situation, because we need to bring together everyone on the left and find a way forward in a situation where people are divided. But at the same time, we can't fall into just, to following what the lead of the Liberals, because that, as I say, will be disastrous. So I think one thing about the situation is, there needs to be a much deeper set of analysis of what's going on the left in order to guide us forward.
Well, as far as the second referendum in the UK on EU membership goes, I can understand why people feel that, or some people can claim at least that, there was a very vague, nebulous offer was put to people as far as the vote goes, and that was essentially because it was never actually sort of meant to happen, so to speak. I mean, Cameron did it as a sop to elements within the Conservative Party. It was like, this issue's just been dogging them for like so long. Okay, let's have this vote. It'll be theatre. Let's get it on, get it over with. Yes, there's going to be a significant vote to leave. We'll deal with that, but ultimately it's not going to go through. So we don't have to have a comprehensive plan. We don't really have to have a coherent anything. It can just be a lot about headlines and, emotive appeals to how people feel about things. And it can be quite superficial. And then lo and behold, massive shock to the system. Oh my God, this has actually happened. And again, I do keep drawing parallels with other events elsewhere in the world, like the election of Trump, and I totally understand your point about these being distinct things, but I think they're linked in important ways, regardless of the colour of the politics. And what you describe is already happening as far as a second vote. And there's lots of people in favour of it, and there's a movement for it. I mean, only today in the news, I think one of the leading British unions came out and supported a call for it.
Well, I mean, just on the stuff you rightly say about the kind of low level of discussion and debate during the first referendum. I mean, that's true. But then, these are debates that are being led by an elite that really is not that interested in a clear discussion and debate about the issues, because, if you actually got down to it, you'd end up talking about things they'd rather not talk about. So, I mean, I don't think necessarily that a second referendum would be any clearer, because you'd still have essentially an establishment desperately trying to convince people by hook or by crook to vote for a European Union that has, whatever else you can say about it, has been presiding over and has been one of the main drivers of the whole neoliberal experiment, and has led and has been, hugely influential in a situation where people's living standards have been cut, wages have been cut, precarity has increased, there's a huge level of privatisation and so on and so forth. So, don't expect, if there was another referendum, that we're going to have, a sudden outbreak of rationality or clarity or even honesty on the part of those involved, of what would still be an elite-led debate on both sides. If it did happen, I mean, I think that, I don't know what the result would be, but all the indications are it wouldn't be massively different from the one that happened a couple of years ago. It might go marginally the other way, but even if it did, what you would see would be a huge sense of anger and outrage, a massively increased feeling that democracy in this country was a sham, that the elites would do anything to get their way. The truth is, it was said at the time, and these are crucial questions when it comes to democracy. It was said at the time, the way that a referendum was framed was that, this would be the moment when the question was decided. And that was what was said at the time. And once you go back on that, really, democracy just becomes relative. I don't particularly like referenda, but in the end of the day, that's what happened. That's how it was pitched. And you relativize that whole process massively at your risk. And I think, really you would have almost inevitably, especially if the left was campaigning for a Remain vote, you would risk a huge rise in the power and the strength of right-wing forces, whether they were the right wing in the Tory party or the right outside of beyond the Tory party, far right forces, or both. I don't know, but I'm sure it would be both actually, because, this would be a gift. It would be a gift to the kind of, the far right, which is trying to reorganize itself and it is to some extent resurgent. And I think it would be a desperately bad mistake. I think it would be wrong in itself. I think it would be wrong on principle, and I think it would have appalling results in British society. Whatever people voted in the thing themselves, we have to accept that is what the decision has been, and we have to work with that decision as best we can.
Well, of course, the general argument has been that, yes, people voted this way, but it was almost like, but they didn't have enough information. But as you say, if you then went to a second referendum and then tried to have a more informed, reasoned, open debate of the issues and potential policies and what have you, you'd be in exactly the same position, which is people don't really want to get down to brass tacks about this because some uncomfortable things would come to light. I just don't see an end to that because that characterises a lot of politics anyway. And also, as you alluded to, if there was a second referendum and the vote went slightly the other way, what the first referendum left us with was a small majority of people who were feeling quite pleased with themselves, and now a lot of them probably quite disillusioned, and a large minority of people who were really angry. You would just have that in reverse. If the decision was reversed, I'm not really sure how that leaves us in a more unified, better place to move forward from.
That's true. And also, the other thing is, those people on the left who are trying to make this the central issue are making a huge mistake, because it's, again, whatever you may think of the question, it's not the central issue. It's not really the thing that ultimately, in a sort of deep way, animates people, because what, the kind of driving force of people's political stances and political attitudes is really things that affect everyday life. And whether you're within or without the European Union, we're going to have to fight to stop the privatisation of the NHS. We are going to have to work very hard to rebuild the trade union movement. We're going to have to, have huge campaigning organisations to take on the privatisation of services and to stop the attacks on the welfare state and so on and so forth. So the idea that the EU is the central question is in a way playing, it's actually one of the things that has played quite well for the establishment in general, even though it has divided the Tory party in a way that is a big problem for them. On the other hand, it has its kind of a prism that has kind of focused politics in a way that sort of distorts or hides the central issues. Who's talking about austerity at the moment? Really, austerity is accelerating incredibly. The level of cutbacks is reaching a critical point in many parts of the country. Services are just falling apart and people's lives are being massively damaged. And the left is going on about, we need a second referendum on the EU, or parts of the left are. That's not clever. It's not sensible. It's in our interests to focus on the issues that really affect our lives deeply and take them on, frontally. So there's a kind of, there's a sort of like way in which the whole EU question is, I'm not saying it's not important, but there is a real sense in which it is a distraction.
Well, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I pay attention to the mainstream media in the UK and around the world to some extent, just as a way, a bit of a barometer of what's going on out there. I want to know what most people are hearing. And every day, I cannot remember, I think I would have made a note of it, the date and the time, if I could remember in recent times having heard a news bulletin that did not feature an item, one or more items on Brexit and one or more items on Donald Trump. There's many other things that recur again and again, but those are two things. It's like Brexit, Trump, day in, day out. And, that exactly reflects that, the obsession that you just mentioned.
Well, I mean, the sort of, the elite media have got a killer instinct in this. They might not be able to actually explain why, but they do sense that, this is in a certain way, this is good for them because it takes politics away from issues of class, and it kind of, it clouds a clear analysis of the situation. And so to that extent, they kind of, they're sort of, magnetized by it really, because, and rightly so from their point of view, because it's kind of creating this fog over British politics, and the sooner we can get beyond it, really, the better. Which is another reason why a second referendum would be disastrous, because it would be like we'd have another year of the whole thing, and I fail to see how that would help. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have serious debates and discussions about the EU. I think it's very important that we do, but it so dominates the political terrain, and it's one of the reasons why Theresa May has been able to survive, actually, in two senses. One, in the sense that she's the only way that the Tory party can think of sort of someone who has, at least in their view, some kind of outside chance of squaring the circle in the Tory party and in the establishment about the EU. But secondly, the whole EU question has actually just distracted people's attention from the carnage that has been created by Tory policies in this country for the vast majority of the population. So, it's not been a good experience, really.
You referenced, everyday issues that affect people's lives, in this sort of here and now. And we also mentioned the resurgence of the far right across Europe, here in the UK, but of course France, Germany, Italy, Greece, Poland, Hungary, even in liberal Sweden, popping up all over the place. And one of the things that many of these parties and movements are doing is appealing to people on the level of everyday things that matter to people trying to get on with their lives, and saying that, the elites are ignoring this, downplaying it, whatever sort of spectre they're invoking, whether it's globalization perhaps, or immigration, whatever it happens to be. And so they're using that absolutely as a tool. And in many ways, there are people who, ordinary, otherwise moderate people, individuals who would perhaps read a manifesto by one of these organizations or parties and say, well, actually, I agree with that. But that could equally be towards on the right of the spectrum, but also the left, because there's a commonality here, and that's another thing that is uncomfortable for some people, is that parties that the mainstream, let's say parties that the liberal media would consider to be far right, quote unquote, or far left, can appeal to people who in many ways their lives look similar, their life situations look similar.
Absolutely, and well, they can appeal to the same people. I mean, it's absolutely clear that's true historically. Not that fascist parties in general in the past have had working class support at their core, but nevertheless they have been able to appeal to sections of the working class and sort of fringes of the working class. There's no question about that. And, you can see, not that UKIP is a fascist party, obviously, but it was clear in 2015 that Jeremy Corbyn's kind of sort of radical appeal for change from below and for, a fairer society and so forth actually did win some people over who voted for UKIP. Something like 30 or 40% of the people who came away from UKIP came to Labour in the last election. So yeah, that's true. But I mean, on the other hand, they're very different. I think we should resist the temptation to, suggest that they're fundamentally or essentially similar, because to the extent that, far right, the UKIPs or the Football Lads Alliances or the AfD in Germany, or these kind of far right parties, to the extent that they sort of reflect class resentment, they do it in a fake way. They attack the elites rhetorically, but what they don't do is develop a serious strategy for working people to improve their lives by winning, redistributive policies or beating privatisation and so on. So, the left does have an advantage here, because the left actually can put forward policies that really do make lives better for working people, whereas the right is relying on kind of culture wars and propaganda and obviously racism as well, which is a kind of way of displacing or diverting the anger that people feel against fake enemies. Whereas what the left can do is target the real problem. And that's the great advantage that the left has. But that speaks of the importance of, being radical and getting to the heart of the matter, which is one of the big arguments we've got to have in the whole sort of Corbynite, experience. There's many people, even who are involved in it at the top particularly, who are very nervous about being too radical, who don't want to, talk about, taxing the rich or, radical new ways of organising nationalisation and so on. It's like all being against the war or, the current, in my opinion, bad mistake of moving away from support for the Palestinians. This is too radical. Actually, it's what people who are really angry want to see is a left that is serious about real fundamental change, because that's people feel fundamentally angry what's going on in society. And unless the left does that, it will never be able to challenge the right. I mean, obviously, there's lots of things that we have to do about the far right, but one of them is we need to have a left-wing movement and political organisation in this country that is openly being seen to be radical and being seen to be fighting for some sort of fundamental change in society. And that's exactly why Corbyn was so popular, because he was that, and he was prepared to be. And he still is, actually. But that element of him, that quality, that essential quality in him and the project, I think is at the moment up for questioning, and that there's a real struggle around those questions.
Well, I mean, just a brief word about, you mentioned, the Palestinians. I'm sure you've been following this recent thread in the news with the Labour Party, which kind of come to a head yesterday, or supposedly some sort of resolution whereby Corbyn and Labour adopt a certain definition of anti-Semitism. And as far as Israel and Palestine goes, I don't really have a dog in the fight. There's good and bad on both sides as far as I'm concerned. I understand it's a matter of degrees. I grew up in Northern Ireland, very, very polarised situation there during the 70s and 80s. There was good and bad on both sides. But my point is, to me, this clearly looks like something. I mean, they've been trying all sorts of smear tactics with Corbyn since he got into the leadership position. But this is just another thing to, any sort of tactic they can possibly get to get that guy out. But also it's a way of just completely smoke screening any other sort of discussion about anything whatsoever.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, it dominated the whole political agenda during the summer at a time when, the Corbyn and the Labour Party should have been going on the offensive against an extremely weak and, divided and incompetent government. So that is one element of it. And secondly, again, as you say, I mean, the idea that Jeremy Corbyn is, as Jonathan Sachs claimed, to be compared to the racist Enoch Powell, or that he's anti-Semitic or racist in any way, is so patently absurd that it should have been enough to convince everyone on the left that although obviously anti-Semitism is a problem and is an issue and needs to be dealt with, nevertheless, this wasn't primarily about anti-Semitism. This is about a continued campaign to try and disorganise and ultimately defeat the whole Corbyn project. That is what has been going on here. And I think it was a big mistake yesterday that the Labour Party NEC, essentially caved in and capitulated, even to the extent of rejecting a policy document or a press statement that Jeremy himself put forward. I mean, that is monumentally stupid in the face of a witch hunt, which is essentially what is going on here. Anyone who has any knowledge of history should know that the only way to deal with a witch hunt is to stand up to it and take it on and try and defeat it. And it wouldn't be that hard to do it in this case, because the argument that is being put forward is so patently ridiculous. And I actually think, most people in the country just must be thinking, what are they talking about? Jeremy Corbyn and anti-Semite. I'm not saying that it's not having an effect. I'm sure it is having an effect on the margins. But, it's not a very strong case. And the fact that the left has prevaricated and retreated, and that Jeremy himself has apologised, and, this was foolish, and it has only encouraged those people who are trying to destroy him. And even now, this decision was supposed to, the accepting of the full IHRA definitions with all the examples, was supposed to draw a line under it. Of course it hasn't. I mean, Margaret Hodge, who's one of the main aggressors and protagonists here, she said, days before the vote, I won't be satisfied if they accept this because I'm after Corbyn. What more do you want? What more evidence do you want that this is a fight to the death, really, about whether the Corbyn project is going to continue? And, retreating on these things, or surrendering, which is what's happened in this case, has no benefit. Well, certainly is a terrible message to send to the Palestinian people, but it's also a very, very bad message to send to the Labour right who are on the attack, because it says, yeah, they're going to back down, so let's keep hitting them, let's keep punching them, because they're not fighting back. And until we fight back, we're going to be on the losing side of this one.
Well, just as I believe that there's a feeding frenzy still in the States for those opposed to Donald Trump, many and varied people from all over the spectrum, can't stand the guy. If he was going to be impeached or thrown out of office, I think it would have happened already. There, on this side of the pond, I think if Corbyn was to be swiftly unseated, I think it would have happened already. I think that he's established himself now. But if elites keep trying to wipe out, to stamp on any of this sort of popular opposition that comes up, whether it's, like, for example, whether it's Jeremy Corbyn, or, like, for example, the way that the Democratic Party dealt with Bernie Sanders in the US, somebody who many commentators said would actually have had a chance of beating Trump, but the way he was just prevented from running. If they keep doing this, it's like just playing whack-a-mole. These problems are not going away. These underlying systemic sort of meta trends are going to keep popping up, and so that will find an outlet. These sentiments, this anger will find an outlet. So it's a question of what's the best way to manage that and how to respond to it. And at the minute, as I say, it just seems to be suppress, demonize, and that's not working, and it's not going to work.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that in general, but again, I would argue for a kind of, a careful analysis of each case, because, I mean, one difference is that in the US, Trump, for all that he is kind of, unpredictable and a maverick and, not fantastic for the elites, he is part of the establishment. And so, in that sense, there's less of a kind of deep-seated desire to get rid of him. In Britain, Jeremy Corbyn is clearly regarded as being a serious threat to the elites, and therefore, they are very, very committed. I mean, I think that's one of the things that's become clear. You talked earlier about the kind of media, consensus against him. I mean, it is absolutely shocking the extent to which even the liberal media is just, is openly prejudiced and biased against him. That's one thing. The other thing is that Donald Trump is fighting back. I don't see enough of that. I mean, I think Jeremy himself is very, very principled and in a certain way quite combative. But where is the rest of the kind of Labour left defending him, fighting his corner? You're not seeing enough of that. And so I'm not quite as confident as you are that this is definitively over and that he is fully established and fully secure in his position. I mean, I very much hope you're right, but I think the left has to do a bit more, really. I think we have to be, because, as I say, Corbyn really is a threat to the establishment. Trump isn't, in the end of the day. I mean, he's an irritant and he's not the man they want to have there. But to be honest with you, they can live with him. They obviously can't live with Jeremy Corbyn. So they are going to do everything they can to crush him. And what worries me is that, this campaign about anti-Semitism and so forth, I mean, it's been pretty full on. And I do think there's a level of coordination to it. And obviously it does have the backing of, I mean, it's quite clear that, there are kind of connections to the Israeli state and so on and so forth. But I mean, if you think this is bad, imagine what it's going to be like if and when Jeremy gets elected to be Prime Minister. Then you are going to see an absolute onslaught with all elements of the state and lots of, the bankers and the big business people really trying to think very, very carefully about how they can destroy his project. So the fact that the left has retreated on this one, I find extremely worrying, because it suggests that people don't really understand what the British state is and the extent to which, if you're going to take on the vested interests in Britain, you've got to be up for a serious fight. You've got to be prepared to hold the line. You've got to be prepared to stand up for what you believe in. And, if there's an attack on you, you've got to be prepared to fight back. And, if you're not, you're gonna fall at the first hurdle once you're elected. So, I just think people really need to start getting a bit more serious about neoliberalism neoliberal capitalism is a deeply embedded project. It's signed up to by the vast majority of the British elites. Their middle class, many of their sort of more wealthy middle class supporters, right across the board, the people that run the universities, the people who run the media, most of the legal system and so on and so forth. And if you want to take it on, you need to have a bit more of a backbone. And I'm afraid that certainly sections of the Labour Party left has shown in the last couple of days.
Well, Chris, as we begin to bring things to a close for today, I just want to go back to something you mentioned close to the top of the hour about a generation now of young people facing a future less well off than their parents, when for many decades, certainly in the post-war period, the opposite was true. That was increasing prosperity. And I was reminded of the book, The Precariat. One quote from the description of that book is, "The young precariat class in Europe has become a serious issue in the early part of the 21st century and has been linked with major populist political developments, including the Brexit referendum and the presidency of Donald Trump." I've linked a lot of these things, and you've put in some well expressed caveats about, just not over-egging that particular pudding. But I think that there are major global trends in place, been in place for a long time, in energy supply, economic trends, environmental trends, that are above and beyond a lot of the day-to-day political machinations, but they have very real direct effects in all our lives. And I think that those going forward are going to completely change the face of global society. And I think that no political party at the end of any colour is going to be able to ignore this. So I think what we're seeing now are the death throes of a lot of systems that we have depended on globally for a long time. And I think a lot of our politics is a poor response to that, based in ignorance, denial, misunderstanding, all sorts of things like that. And the challenge then is for those people who see the need for change to develop ways to navigate all of this chaos in order that we come out the other side with a possibility of salvaging a future. And I think that Corbyn's Labour Party and other movements that we've talked about around the world all have a part to play in this. And I think that these changes are going to sweep away the basis for neoliberal capitalism. I think, and whatever replaces it, who knows, that's up for grabs.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're right about that. I mean, clearly, the whole sort of the crisis of politics at the moment is an expression of a much wider series of crises, which are, to do with obviously the terrible state that the economy is in, the world economy is in, where, profitability is under threat, and there's these huge levels of debt, which are themselves a sign of a kind of deep malaise in the system. But also, as you again say, I mean, I found the summer quite scary. I mean, it was quite nice to have such a, best summer since 76 or even better, but it was also worrying because, it's quite clear. You look across the maps of, this wasn't just some accidental, isolated thing that happened in Britain. I mean, right across whole swathes of Europe and beyond, temperatures were reaching beyond record levels. And, that is almost definitely connected to measured, quantifiable climate change, which is deeply terrifying. It's going to have a huge impact on all sorts of ecosystems around the world. And you do feel there's a level of turmoil and turbulence in the world, which is very, very frightening at the moment. But the question of how those things play out and whether the human race is going to be able, I mean, it is that dramatic, whether the human race is going to be able to deal with these problems, which I think we can. I think we have the capacity to, we have the science to, we have the creativity to. But the question of whether we do or not is going to be decided by political responses. And I mean that in the broadest sense, not necessarily by particular elections or just by, what happens in conventional politics, but it is going to be decided by organised responses and by a kind of the quality of the analysis and the policies and the programs that can be put forward by the left. So it still is, these are still political questions, and whether or not we can stem the tide of inequality depends on whether we can, create a movement strong enough to challenge the super rich, whether we can at least limit the damage done by climate chaos depends on whether we can create a democratic grassroots movement that has the strength to control the big corporations and to insist on some sense of responsibility and a reduction in carbon emissions and huge changes in the way we travel and the way we live our lives. But these things can only be imposed by political movements, in my opinion. And so, nothing's inevitable. These changes can happen and they can lead to, Rosa Luxemburg said back in the period after the First World War, she said, either socialism or barbarism. And I think that is really either we're going to see the re-establishment or the establishment of control over our societies by the vast majority of ordinary people, and a kind of some sort of creative planning that actually does push an agenda of the benefits to the human race as a whole. Or we're going to see these tiny percentage of the 1% pursuing the interests of, profit and banking come what may. And those are the two options that face us today. And it's a huge challenge. But I mean, one thing you can say about what's happened certainly in Britain, where you have had Corbyn, doing so well, it's quite clear that lots of people recognise this. I mean, Corbyn got 13 million votes in the general election. That's 13 million people who were prepared to vote for a man who is against war, who wants to deal with climate change, who wants to deal with racism, who wants to deal with inequality. And people knew that, Corbyn was so vilified by the right wing and the press that no one voted for Corbyn without knowing who he was. So there clearly is a big, big constituency of people who want to do something about the the state of the world we're in and have some pretty good ideas about how to do it. The question is, can those people get organised? Can we improve the sort of leadership of the movement and create a dynamic and thoughtful, but at the same time very, very seriously committed movement for change quick enough? I think we can, but it's going to be a tough call.
Okay, two short final points. One potentially a bit pessimistic, one ultimately optimistic. In terms of the political response to some of these developments, do you worry about draconian measures, outbreaks of violence, civil unrest as things go forward? Think of an establishment response to increasing unrest, but also ultimately, what gives you hope? It sounds like in some of your comments that you just made there a moment ago that lies there, really.
Yeah, I mean, I was one of the people who's involved in organising the movement against the Iraq war. And I mean, in a way, once you've been involved in a demonstration in which 1 to 2 million people marched against a government, against a war that was happening thousands and thousands of miles away, not because they were going to be immediately affected by themselves by it, but because they thought it was wrong. They thought Blair was lying. They didn't want people to die in Iraq, and they were prepared to come out in their hundreds of thousands. Once you've been involved in that, in a way, you think, well, actually, anything is possible. That the idea that people don't care or are apathetic or are completely taken in by the mainstream is just clearly not true. I mean, as I say, that, in a way, Jeremy Corbyn is, to some extent, the whole Corbyn phenomenon is a kind of long-term outcome of the anti-war movement and the campaigns that he's been involved in. He's won 2 elections in the Labour Party. He did very well in the general election. In the teeth of a massive media campaign, the whole of the political establishment being against him, ridiculing him, demonising him. And yet people still came out for him, and that makes me very, very hopeful. Even now, the opinion polls show that people are still up for voting for him. And, that shows that, there's lots of working people in Britain who pretty much know what's going on. And in a way, what we need to do is to organise that opinion or help people who have those opinions to get organised, because the question of leadership here is very, very important, and that comes down to also whether you have a kind of participatory or whether you have a passive view of how change happens. I happen to believe that the kind of fundamental change we need is something that can only come about if people are mobilised and if people are doing themselves, if people are organised in their communities, in their workplaces, in their unions, on a massive scale. That even if you did get Jeremy elected, unless he's got a force of people who are prepared to come out and defend him and push him forward and change things from below, then really, a handful of people in Parliament are not going to be strong enough to withstand the pressures of the elites and the establishment and the state that will be mobilised against them. So, yeah, I have an optimism, and the optimism is based on people's clear capacity to protest, to be creative, to come up with alternative ideas in the process of getting active. But, I do think that we have to be absolutely clear. This isn't going to happen just through a process of an election. And people say, we've got to wait till 2022. We can't wait till 2022. We can't have this government for another 4 years because there won't be any NHS left. There won't be any welfare state left. We have to put our faith in and our confidence in people's ability to take action themselves. And, that's where we have to go here, I think. I mean, clearly the Corbyn project is crucial, but it has to be linked to the kind of mobilisations and the mass movements that, when you get down to it, have always been the things that have made, good changes happen. And that's where my optimism comes from, and that's where my hope comes from for the future.
Chris, today we've been talking about your recent book, How the Establishment Lost Control. That's available everywhere, all the usual outlets, as we like to say. Just before we sign off, have you got an online presence that you might like to share with listeners, or just anything else you'd like to put out there?
Well, I mean, I'm on Facebook. Please do link up with me there. I'm involved in the Stop the War Coalition, and Stop the War has got a big, social media presence on all platforms. I'm also involved with Counterfire, which is a socialist organisation, which again is out there on all platforms. Please hook up with that. And if you want to get the book as well.
Excellent. Well, Chris, thank you so much for joining us today on legalisefreedom.com.
I've enjoyed it.
Quite like the fact there's a siren in the background for that last bit.
Yeah, that's appropriate.